everybody. I hope you guys are doing well today. I wanted to make kind of an esoteric video. I haven't done one of these in a while. And so I wanted to explain what's called the Hermetic wisdom, all right? And to understand alchemy or astrology, the ancient forms, not horoscopes or anything like this, the traditional forms of these things, you have to understand the macrocosm, which is a reflection of the microcosm, which are both in this divine unity or divine harmony with what's called the metacosm. What do all these terms mean that I'm just throwing out there? The macrocosm is the order of the cosmos, the stars, the moon, the sun, everything like that. The order of the heavenly bodies. The microcosm is the soul we possess. It is looking inward, internally, the soul we possess. And the metacosm is the invisible spiritual realm that envelops the presence of God, the visible spiritual realm that envelops all of reality. All right, so to understand astrology, to understand alchemy, which is eventually a video I want to do is about alchemy, you have to understand how the microcosm, or rather the macrocosm, so the order of the cosmos, the reflection of the microcosm, our soul, which is in divine unity with the spiritual world that is around us. All right. And so in particular, I'm going to focus today on the microcosm. In other words, the soul that we possess. This is found in the writings of Hermes Trismegistus, who was purported to be, a pagan god in the Hellenic culture. Is supposed to be like the syncretist god who combined Thoth and Hermes together. What's really interesting is that Saint Albert the Great believed that this pseudo-history, basically, it's not a real person. I hope everyone understands I don't believe that this is like a real god or anything like that. Obviously, it's pseudo-history. But regardless, Saint Albert the Great, and I do believe this is like, the story is basically a seed form of the incarnate Logos that was found in Hellenic culture, and is part of the primordial tradition. In other words, that the wisdom contained in the Hermes of Trismegistus is something that you'll see in many perennial traditions, and it's something that is contained very keenly in Orthodox and Eastern Christianity. And I'll have to do various videos about that as well. And you see it in the writings of Plato as well. It's very similar to Platonic epistemology. And so let's begin with Plato. In Plato's Apology, Socrates is told by the Oracle of Delphi that he was the wisest man in all of Athens. And of course, Socrates was in disbelief. How could he be the wisest man in all of Athens when, as Socrates claimed, he knew nothing? That was his great aporia. The only thing I know, said Socrates, that I know nothing. So how can he be the wisest? So Socrates sets out to find the answer to this. So he asks various patricians and lawyers to basically disprove the oracle. And he asks them, do you think you're wise? And the various patricians and prelates and lawyers all said, yes, I believe I'm wise because of my vast knowledge or my vast intuition or something like that. And Socrates walks away realizing that he is the wisest person because all of these people have deluded themselves into thinking that they have knowledge. That Socrates is the only person who recognizes his own ignorance. And therefore, by recognizing his own ignorance, he is the wisest. He really knows what is important. And so this is like a paradox, though, because how can you know something if you claim to know nothing? How can you know that you know nothing? And the way that Plato basically subtly and implicitly answers this is that there's a different kind of knowledge that's at stake here. Is that the knowledge that these patricians have is discursive. It is the same knowledge I have that this glasses rag is blue. It's something I combine a concept, blue, with an intuition or a perception, immediate perception of this object here. In other words, that there is some kind of dynamic or a relation between an object and a subject. Whereas the kind of knowledge that tells Socrates that he knows nothing is something that comes from within him. It is some supra-knowledge that is not empirically discoverable, but it is ingrained in Socrates, and from whence his wisdom is derived. Now, this is an analogy for our relationship with God. According to the Hermetic tradition, according to most of the church fathers, especially in the East, such as Saint Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, and this is what's called the apophatic tradition, is that we cannot know the essence of God. We don't know the essence of God. We cannot positively predicate to God anything, because we cannot know God in an empirical way. We cannot have discursive knowledge of God. We can only know God through negation. We can say what God isn't. He isn't a sinner. He isn't limited. He isn't material. So we can say, talk about God in a negative way, but this wasn't for Saint Mary of Egypt or Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, an intellectual exercise, but rather it was a profound spiritual act in which we basically have to look inward to find the kingdom of heaven within us. As the gospel writer writes, that the kingdom of heaven is within you. And so we have to look within ourselves to find God, not in discursive knowledge, but to find God in ourselves, basically in an ingrained or a supra-knowledge form. And that's the only way that we'll be able to experience God and to predicate to God negatively. The reason why we have to do this is because in order to predicate to something positively, in order to have discursive knowledge, there has to be some relation between ourselves, the subject, and an object. Namely, like I am near an object, or I perceive this glasses rack. But the relation between God and ourselves is nothing like a relation between an object and a subject, because God is so more transcendent. He's beyond the material realm. God's essence, that is to say the Godhead, is the absolute reality. It is outside the created world, and therefore it is identical to nothing. We cannot identify it in any meaningful way with a subject or an object, or have any kind of relation to it. And that is why God says that I am who I am. I am the great I am, because his identity is himself. He can only identify with himself. The way I can identify this object is not how God identifies himself, because there is no relation. There is no relationality that is external to God. Now, there's a relation within God, and that is the Trinity, but there's no relation external to God from the created world to God. And so that is why we cannot look outside ourselves to find God, but we have to look within, according to the apophatic tradition. And that's kind of what I want to explain. How do we look in? What does that mean? Nevertheless, though, the emanations of God, or as the Saint Gregory of Palamas calls the energies of God, which are not identical to his essence, but rather they come from his essence. But nonetheless, they are perfectly divine. So his energies, God's energies, are divine completely and perfectly. So too is his essence completely and perfectly divine. The energies of God are like rays of light from the sun. Just as the rays of light aren't the sun, but at the same time, they're perfectly light. In the same way that the sun is also light. And these rays of light, basically the energies of God, they come to us, they exist within us, they exist within everything, as I'll basically explain. It's the emanations of God that manifest itself in all principle and reality, and it's through direct intuition. It is through direct intuition or direct experience with the divine light that we're able to know God. Not know God in a discursive sense, but in some kind of supra-knowledge sense, in the same way that Socrates knew he was the wisest person in Athens. And that is something that's built in. That is something that is part of our ontological faculty, is the emanations of God. And that's what we have to do. We have to look into the darkness of our soul to find God. So what does that all mean? I'm like saying a lot here, kind of in a very vague and broad sense. So let's get very specific. There are three aspects to man. the tripartite soul, as Plato says. The first, the most base, is our animal appetites, our appetitive inclinations, our instincts. The next is the psyche, or basically, or sometimes it's called the soul. It is the center of self-consciousness. It is responsible for our reasoning skills. It's responsible for our discursive knowledge. It gives us the sense of I, such as I as anime-rightus. When I say I am anime-rightus. The fact I can predicate this I to myself is in part because of the psyche. It is because of the soul that it creates this the synthesis of my various consciousness experiences, and it recognizes my continual existence within that. It recognizes it, synthesizes it together into one complete identity. And that's what the psyche does. It's because of that part of the soul. Finally, then, now it drives the entire body, and this is sometimes called the window into the heart, or the eye of the heart. This is what gives us our spiritual core, in a sense, is the nous. It is the pure spirit, sometimes called, or the immaterial intellect. It's kind of the way I would say Aristotle describes it. It's the immaterial part of our mind. It's the way in Greek it's the nous, N-O-U-S. And it's basically the spark of God, that uncreated light that I spoke about. That it's the emanations of God that come from God, that exist in us, in other words, and they only are manifested through the Logos. So it's the Logos, the divine word that is manifested in all of us, and that makes us all made in the image of God. And this is a quote here from Titus Buckhart, the famous perennial traditionalist. He says, quote, "The universal intellect, or the nous, is not one numerically, but one in its indivisibility. In this way, it is wholly present in each creature, and from each creature derives its uniqueness. From there is nothing which possesses more unity, wholeness, and perfection than that through which it is known. That which confers the egoic limitation on the infinite light of the intellect is not the body, but the soul." In other words, the spark of God is one complete unity. It is immaterial, it is purely spiritual, and therefore it is something that is unified. Now, what gives it unique, but what gives us our own unique identity is the psyche, or is our consciousness. Our various conscious experiences give us, as Titus Buckhart calls it, that egoic, the ego, the part, the I. It gives us that limitation that exists because of the interaction between the uncreated light that exists within us and our experiences as conscious beings in this material world. And so basically, in other words, we all share the indivisible nous. We all share the indivisible nous, but we are individuated by the interaction between our conscious experiences and the pure spirit. And it is the intellect, after all, which basically generates our self-consciousness. Without the intellect, there could be no self-consciousness, because if we are simply matter, if we're simply materialists, then we could never have universal concepts. But because we have universal concepts, this tells us there must be something immaterial about us that generates our consciousness. Otherwise, we would just be the same as like an animal. An animal, when it sees a gate, doesn't think, oh look, there's a gate. They just see a particular object that they're aware of. But as humans, we can recognize concepts and universals, and that's what gives us that self-consciousness. All right. What does this all mean about what I'm saying about universals and versus a particular? Well, as a particular gate versus a the concept or the category of gate. In other words, we're able to recognize forms. This is a very Platonic way of talking about it. Or prototypes is the Hermetic way of speaking about it. We don't have to see it. How do we know that this exists? How do we know that this is a real category, and not just something that we've created? And the proof is that we don't have to see every species of dog to recognize the form of a dog. And so, in other words, if I saw a dog and I didn't recognize, this, I never knew before the species, I'd still be able to recognize that it's a dog because I know the form of a dog. Another example would be like, I don't need to see every metal, kind of metal, to recognize the prototype of metal. I'm aware of what metal, the prototype of metal is, without having to see every individual metal or every individual kind of metal, species or genus of metal. And this is only possible. The only way that this is possible is because of that immaterial part of our mind. And in particular, it's possible because of the emanations of the logos from the nous, As the emanations of the logos from the nous to the psyche, which basically recognize the emanations with an I. So let me be very clear. The emanations of the logos, that's with an E. The emanations, like the rays of the sun that emanates, the emanations of the logos in the nous to the psyche, recognize the emanations with an I. In other words, how God manifests himself through the logos. That's how God always manifests himself, is through the second person of the Trinity in the created world, in nature. And so God's spirit, or God's manifestations, present all around us. It's present in nature through the logos, through prototypes, through forms, because everything has structure and principle. Talk about the form of dog, a form of metal. Everything has a qualitative aspect. Rene Guénon basically proves this in Reign of Quantity and Sign of the Times, that even in math there is still an understanding of quality. There's a qualitative aspect that requires some kind of principle, some kind of order that structures everything together, and that creates essence versus substance and form. And these create categories that can only exist in the mind of God, and therefore are reflected in all of nature through the manifestation, or manifested in all nature through the logos. And they are the emanations of God. And it is only because the logos exists within us, because we have that spark of God within us, that we recognize God's handiwork. We recognize these forms outside of us. We recognize the eternal prototypes and the archetypes. The archetypes meaning beauty, goodness, truth, virtue, that is embodied within the world around us. We know that this must be the case because without some unconditioned, in other words, there's something that is absolute or something that is immaterial part of ourselves, there'd be no bridge between the subject and the object. We can never move from the I to the thou, or from my experience to the collective experience. There would only be countless worlds and countless perspectives from every person. Every individual would have a different perspective than mine, and they would all be equally valid. But if there is something immutable within all of us, and there's something immutable that is the same within all of us, and we can standardize and we can have a common benchmark or common standard for our experience, and therefore we can say that the world I observe, that the form of dog I see is the same form of dog you see. And that saves us from a lot of the Cartesian puzzles, you could say. How do I know that the world around us is an illusion, and things like that. It saves us from a lot of those and some other kinds of solipsism and things like that. It's able to save us from that if we recognize that that we can standardize experience because we all have the logos within us. And this is the fundamental idea of the microcosm, this interaction in our soul between the various parts, the nous, or the nous, the psyche, and our appetitive appetites. And what's interesting is that even after the fall, we can experience universals. So of course, like I said, all things reflect the goodness of God. In particular, humans are most perfectly radiate the emanations of God. The Logos most perfectly is contained within us, for we're made in God's image. However, after the fall, the intellect, the nous, was darkened and our will corrupted. Nevertheless, it was only darkened because we were still able to recognize the universals, and even to a limited extent various transcendentals like goodness and beauty and things like that. But we can never be good, or we can never please God without a change from God. And that is why we have to have some miracle, basically, or something external like Holy Communion that can come into us, and then there can be a substantial change that the noose can be shine bright once more. It can be unleashed from the darkness. And that is only through the through Christ basically transmitting himself to us in Holy Communion that is able to occur. Through Holy Communion, we receive the body, blood, soul, and divinity, and so the noose is basically able to be fed. So not only is we're receiving something physical, the bread, but it's something that's material. It's materially bred or accidentally bred, but substantially present is Christ, who is going to feed us spiritually and going to feed the noose and unleash it. So that way its emanations, the emanations of the Holy Spirit, can fundamentally change the way we act and the way we think and the way we feel. And so that is why it's so important that through initiation and through the sacraments that we have this esoteric experience. And that's kind of the basics of esotericism, is looking inward at the noose to try to unlock it, unleash it, so that the Holy Spirit and the emanations, the Holy Spirit is basically the emanations of God. The Logos is basically the manifestation of God. And then God, of course, is the absolute, can all be accomplished in our souls. And we can perfectly unite ourselves in the energies of God. And so that's all I wanted to talk about today. And I think that's a important kind of philosophic idea that's going to come up in the future. So be ready for more videos that are going to build on those ideas. I'm going to have talk about alchemy, hesychism, demon slayer, all sorts of things that surprisingly come back to this idea. So thank you guys. I'll see you all in the next video.